So welcome everybody. I'm André Thor and I welcome you to the ERSA JRC Roundtable on multifaceted innovation for territorial post-COVID response. And as the president of ERSA, I must say that I'm very happy to jointly organize this event with the Joint Research Center of Seville, JRC. So this roundtable reflects the quality of our relation and the convergence of our views with the European Commission that was proved already by a very, very successful winter school jointly organized in January on smart specialization, and also by the various DG, Regio lectures organized jointly by ERSA and DG Regio, and this year online. Today, we would like to present you some views and to discuss with you about the future responses to the COVID pandemic. JRC has built a splendid program with many good speakers, you will see, both academics and stakeholders, and it will give you, hopefully, the opportunities to think about the impacts of COVID on territories and cities, but also to share ideas about the possible situation for the futures. So I will not be too long now because I will come back at the end of the process after the second slot. But before to start, I would like to thank again the JRC team for the splendid work and the collaboration, and to warmly thank Alessandro Reinoldi and Carlotta Ferretti for their very friendly way of doing things and for their excellent organization, most of all. So I immediately leave the floor to Alessandro Reinoldi. Alessandro, please.
Thank you very much, André, and thanks a lot for your very nice words. I must say I share totally your views, your thanks. So I would like to thank ERSA for having suggested the organization of this roundtable, and on our side too, it really reflects the commonality of interests, of views on issues that are very close to our work and to our hearts in pursuing research, analysis, and policy support on how territories can overcome the COVID pandemics and the consequence of the pandemics on their economy and social structures, and finding what could be the meaningful enablers for territories to actually put together, design, implement meaningful strategies for a post-COVID world. André, you mentioned the successful winter school. I share this too, and I hope there will be more opportunities to work together. It's a pleasure to work with you and your team, definitely. At the JRC, I am head of the Territorial Development Unit. We work indeed, as the name of the unit says, on places, on understanding how policies impact on places and how places can inform the policy making exercise, how the characterization, the articulation of policies shapes the effort on individual places, but also how place-based approaches can be more impactful and more insightful for a broader strategic approach at the European level. That's the way we have worked on this roundtable indeed. coming from efforts going on in these last years on smart specialization, as you mentioned, but also on urban development strategies, and more recently on rural innovation, we would like to use and to discuss with you and with those who are listening to us today on how COVID and the COVID shock has been articulated and has impacted in all places where people live and work, in cities on one side, in rural and remote areas on the other side. We would like to find out which kind of general enablers can facilitate the policy response and the recovery. And we believe that innovation, and more specifically place-based innovation, can be indeed a powerful tool, a powerful enabler. We have been adopting a broader view of innovation, so we don't want to talk only about the technology, but also all kinds of innovation. And when we talk about places, I'm also thinking of innovation in institutions and innovation in partnering with local communities and in partnering across territories, because these tools can also innovate the way policies are made, are implemented at the local level. We would like to find out whether there are common threads that put together cities, towns, rural areas, and which kind of specificities on the other side have a concrete role in some specific categories of territories. But I would not like to spend more words on this. I would just like to give the floor to the distinguished panelists of the first session of this roundtable, which is going to talk about smart territories in times of COVID. And I am pleased to leave the floor to the moderator of this session, my colleague, Martina Pertoldi. So Martina, please, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Many thanks, Alessandro, for your speech, and also Andre, and welcome to this first session. My name is Martina Pertoldi, and I work as a researcher in the Territorial Development Unit of the Joint Research Center. And I will moderate this first session, Smart Territories in Time of COVID. The speakers of this session are Philip Mckenn from Sheffield University, Brionni Godwin-Hawkins from the University of Gloucestershire, and Christina Jokelainen from the consulting firm Smart North, based in Lapland. We will have the three speakers presenting, and then we will have a dedicated slot for questions. So feel free to send your questions via the chat to the speakers, to a specific speaker, or more in general to all of them. Also because we wanted to feed the debate at the end of the presentation with your questions. We will collect them and pass as many as we can to our speakers. Thanks. Well, in this session, as already said, we will address the territorial dimension of the COVID-19 recovery and the related challenges and policy responses that have emerged already or could possibly emerge. And we will focus more specifically on place-based approaches to innovation. The role of innovation for regional development is a topic, in fact, that the JRC has been investigating extensively in the last years in a number of projects that go under the umbrella of the Smart Specialization Platform, or our more recent research activities on urban and territorial strategies supported by cohesion policy, where we address explicitly the sub-regional and local level, so that we integrate the knowledge and expertise on innovation from more technocratic, let's say, point of view, but also including soft elements that are for us very, very relevant, as I said. In the past 25 years, we can say that the importance of innovation has grown progressively in EU policy. That can be seen, for example, in cohesion policy, which has basically, in the Kevin Morgan's words, has become a vehicle for an increasingly spatially targeted form of innovation policy, looking really at places and their innovation potential. And spanning to the mission-oriented approach of Horizon Europe for targeting research and innovation investments. This is even more valid today with the EU recovery package, where innovation-driven policy for sustainability drive opportunities for economic recovery. Moreover, to enlarge this overview, let's say at European level, the Commission has joined forces and recently published a long-term vision for rural areas, which promotes innovation ecosystems, digitalization, and economic transformation, among other key actions for rural areas, placing rural areas really at the core of the EU development strategy. Innovation from public administration to local stakeholders, including social innovators, is also well mentioned in the Territorial Agenda 2030 that was signed during the EU German presidency in December 2020 by the European ministers responsible for spatial planning, territorial development, and territorial cohesion. In this sense, we can see that there is a kind of convergence from different words on the topic of innovation. And in a way, this session touches upon topics that have been on the agenda for a long time now. So far, nothing new, we could say. But however, even if it's difficult to say if permanent or ephemeral, the COVID-19 pandemic has made us think differently about how we see and how we value things. For example, well-being, and anyone with a little kid at home knows perfectly what I mean. But also how we frame innovation and what we aim at by investing on innovation. What are we doing this? What are the final goal for which we are doing this investment? But this is also a kind of contradictory elements in it, as for example, short-term recovery needs could be at odds with long-term development objectives, in particular regarding, for example, sustainability objectives. So in this session, we'll discuss what are the new challenges brought up or maybe amplified by the current COVID situation. Are they totally new, or are they bringing up something that was already there? What are the trends that we can grasp on? What are the new elements we should take into account? What policy responses are emerging? What can we learn from that? Is a kind of, as I was saying, a progressive approach, or is more about let's go back to the old way? And finally, what policy approaches can more effectively support territories in their long-term development path beyond recovery, much, let's say, far than that, and looking ahead for our future development. Today, we will have the opportunity to explore these issues from different points of view and different territorial dimension, more academic, more related to the EU policy world, or more, let's say, at the interface between policy and research, or even at the very policy making level. But let's start, I would say. Our first speaker is Philip Mckenn. He's certainly well known to the ERSA and the JRC communities, but I would like to shortly remind you about him and why it's here actually to help us with his views. Philip Mckenn is Professor of Urban and Regional Economics in the University of Sheffield Management School, and is also connected to the University of Cambridge and the University of Groningen. He's one of the world's most cited scholars in his field, and he has also acted as advisor to the European Commission, to specific services of the European Commission, to the OECD, but also as a special advisor to 2 European commissioners for regional and urban policy. Recently, he also co-authored the JRC report, Place-Based Innovation for Sustainability, which reflects on the future shape of innovation policy within cohesion policy. And by the way, you can find it on the JRC Smart Specialization Platform website. Therefore, I would say he's extremely well placed to discuss the challenges that EU policy has to cope with when addressing the COVID-19 recovery, if we want to maintain our pre-COVID goals, or how we should consider the different situation in order to make our objectives finally. With no further delay, I'll give the floor to Philip. Thanks.
Thanks, Martina. I'll just try and share my screen to bring my slides up. Can you see that, Martina?
Yes, perfect. Thanks. Yeah.
Okay, so I have about 15 minutes. Is that correct? Okay.
Yes, please.
Okay, so as Martina just mentioned, I've been working with the JRC over the last few years, primarily alongside Johan Stierner and most importantly, Luc Sote. And the question we've been thinking about alongside the JRC team is, what role do regions and regional policy play in the context of the Green Deal challenges? So the move to net zero, climate mitigation strategies. And just precisely at this moment, as we were working on these issues, and as Martina just said, the report that I'm going to refer to has been published, then of course we're hit by coronavirus. So there's so much going on. So I'm going to try and give you an overview of what the issues are and how we see them and think about them. And the JRC is going to be working in more detail on exactly these points over the coming years, and I'm very pleased to be part of that intellectual effort. So of course, you know, in a conference like this, I don't really need to explain much about cohesion policy itself. Obviously, there's different strands of policy, there's different funding systems, there's different national and EU-wide priorities, also national and regional co-financing, management, shared management responsibilities. All of these issues are core to how the policies work. But if we go back to the 2014-2020 agenda, in terms of the reforms to cohesion policy, if we look back to the Europe 2020 agenda, the thematic pillars, if you like, smart, sustainable, and inclusive growth, you know, they map on very closely to the OECD, which was clean, stronger, fairer, cleaner, you know, simple type of tripartite classification. Smart specialization plays an important role in that, in driving place-based prioritization. And the JRC, of course, with the platform, has been absolutely critical in pushing that agenda forward in the context of what the European 2020 agenda was. And of course, underlying all this is this link between entrepreneurial search, entrepreneurial activities, and innovation. So everything being driven by innovation, with entrepreneurship acting as the spark that catalyzes and facilitates and promotes those innovation-related activities. So that's the broad line up in terms of thinking in terms of how innovation is related to regional policy in the post-reform period. Now, of course, let's just do a quick thumbnail sketch of where we are. And of course, many of you are well aware of this. But basically, we've had these enormous structural and sectoral shocks associated with COVID, particularly things like travel and tourism, hospitality, supply chains in areas such as automotive, high street retail, and so on. We've got suddenly excess supply in graduate labor markets, school leaver labor markets, insufficient demand. So there's a lot of shocks in terms of the skills agenda, pathways to training, and so on. And then also we've had this shock, in a sense, somewhat similar to the 2008 crisis, where you went from broadly a normal type of environment where you're, you know, putting risk return profiles, trying to put numbers on different issues, to a situation where you go to an environment of uncertainty, not risk, where it's not possible to quantify things. And that happened again, of course, early last year. And then slowly we're coming out of this. But what's really interesting is there's still so much uncertainty about the recovery process. And if you look at all the official predictions, country by country or blocks of countries about what's going to happen, they still seem to change every couple of weeks. There is a great deal of uncertainty. What we do know is, of course, the time to roll out the vaccines is critical in terms of the scale of scarring. Thankfully, across Europe, the rate of that has been quick and is ongoing. But still, there are huge coordination problems between countries and governments and so on. What we do know is that there's going to be systematically bigger government debt and deficits. We know that tends to mean a greater centralization of national power, reduced power at the local and the regional level governance, precisely because of the financial and the fiscal shocks. We know that the COVID crisis has also accelerated a lot of IT related activities, artificial intelligence, 3D printing. There's been huge shocks to a lot of systems which have accelerated the take-up of these types of technologies, and there's a lot of evidence on this. And this is likely to affect global value chains, a certain amount of nearshoring of activities and so on. But we're not really going to know until sometime next year or even early the year after before we really have a sense of what's going on. I'll just jump on from here. I've just explained this point about measuring and non-measuring. Certain areas which are likely to be in the eye of the storm are particularly SMEs, because when you get any shocks to the economy, you tend to have credit-related shocks as well. Any macroeconomic or structural shocks tend to be replicated in terms of financial shocks related to credit, and SMEs tend to go to the back of the queue. We know that that's already the case. And in particular, what tends to happen is highly innovative SMEs go to the very back of the queue for financing, because when banks are under pressure, you don't have resources or time, then it's expensive to investigate innovation activities. It's much easier, you understand what a hairdresser does, for example, or a greengrocer type of shop selling fruit and vegetables. It's easy to understand. Technology often is very, very difficult and requires a lot of time. And the other areas, of course, that have been hit tremendously are real estate markets, particularly city centre real estate markets. There's a report in the Financial Times just yesterday on the flatlining of yield rates across cities, across Europe and the UK. So there's clearly big shocks, but we still don't really understand how these things are going to play out. A couple of things I think are likely. One is that you'll get higher risk spreads across regions in terms of financial risk yields. That tends to move against convergence and tends to promote divergence. At the same time, there's going to be greater concentration of monopoly positions in the private markets. That again tends to favor core regions, and also greater governance centralization because of the fiscal shocks. All of these things tend to favor core regions. On the other hand, people's ability to work from home, telework and so on will tend to push against that. So there may be some sort of pushback in favor of more remote or weaker regions, but the net effect at the moment, my guess is, will be more towards concentration than decentralization. But we will see these things in the coming years. Now, one of the things which is still there, largely has been off the table because people have been focused globally on the pandemic, is the whole issue about climate change challenges. Those climate change mitigation strategies, the need for those hasn't gone away. It's just been delayed by several years. And of course, the IPCC report that came out 2 weeks ago basically says that actually the rate of climate change is faster than we realized. And there's more evidence on that. And we've just lost between 2 and 3 years in the response to that because people are focused on other things. And the priority for countries is to get people back in work again, to get people off government books in terms of where funding is helping businesses stay alive, people's incomes are being paid even though they're not particularly working. All of that has been the priority, and that's still the priority for most countries, is to recover as quickly as possible from these shocks. So one of the effects is that the climate change responses post the Paris Agreement have simply been stopped largely. Now, there is a lot of optimism in certain areas that this is going to kickstart a new green agenda, environmental switches. I think I'm probably not as positive as many people would seem to be. I think my feeling would be the overriding sense is that governments just want to get people back to work. And the Green Deal type of issues are going to be pushed back several years. And that's obviously from a climate change perspective, this is a tragedy, but I think it's probably a political reality. Now, in terms of where cohesion policy sits in all of these things, the likelihood is COVID will in many cases make a lot of weaker regions more vulnerable. That's a starting point, but it is different country by country. There are big differences between these effects on country. And along with my co-authors, Raquel Ortega-Argiles and Pei Yu Wan, we've actually we're just about to finish a paper which is dealing with 600 regions across Europe in a multi-nested framework. And we find a lot of these COVID-related effects are very specific to different types of localities. Having said that, we also know that from the European Union point of view, the Green Deal was a huge priority, and it was launched, literally the months and the weeks leading up to the coronavirus pandemic. So for many people, there was a great deal of interest and excitement about this, but then suddenly it was largely curtailed because of the need to focus on the crisis. The paper by Luc Soto and myself, it's called Place-Based Innovation for Sustainability. It's published by the Joint Research Centre. And what we're arguing is that in the context of the green agenda, the Green Deal at the European level is a top-down way of thinking. It's a top-down, almost like a sectoral way of thinking about how to address a problem. And it's also saying the problem is urgent and we need huge resources directed, focused, in order to respond to these. The difficulty, of course, is that there are trade-offs in terms of climate mitigation strategies, and those trade-offs are explicitly articulated by place, by region. So if you think about, go back to the Europe 2020 agenda, smart, sustainable, inclusive, a difficulty there, and of course people at the JRC are well aware of this, is lots of regions would immediately grab the smart. Okay, we're going to do the science type stuff, the techie stuff, because that also, that looks good. The inclusive stuff, not sure about that. We'll kind of leave that till a bit later. That's a bit more difficult. And the sustainable, well, it kind of depends. Maybe, maybe not. But the point about this is that many localities treated the Europe 2020 agenda as a menu, that you can do smart, or you can do sustainable, or you can do inclusive. And you see this also in terms of the allocation of funds across the different funding streams. The problem is that they're often not aligned at a local level, or only partially aligned. So you can often end up with trade-off. If you're going to do smart, it may not be inclusive. It may be much more focused on the higher end, the higher human capital end. If you're going to do sustainable, if you think in terms of an environmental sense, the problem is how do you do sustainability, which is also socially sustainable? There may be complementarities there, but there may be trade-offs. And actually, we've started to see a lot of this across different parts of Europe. And the difficulty is if places are treating this as a kind of a menu, that the danger is these very long-term, slow-burning, but critical issues around sustainability and inclusion often get left behind. They get left till later. And in a sense, that's what the COVID crisis has accelerated, a tendency to push these things back. And if we have to respond quickly, let's do the smart, new medical investments, new vaccination therapies and so on, because that's a priority. We've got to be clever, we've got to be quick. But the difficulty is the climate change mitigation agenda is not quick. We have to be quick, but the issues have to be very long lasting. And so one of the arguments we've put forward is to basically to impose a logical ordering on smart specialization. We call it S4 plus instead of S3, because it's smart for sustainable, smart for inclusive. And really what's needed is a restructure in terms of how funding is allocated so that innovation related activities have to be explicitly linked to sustainability and explicitly linked to inclusiveness. because there's a lot of innovation related activities that go under the smart specialization headings, which are not particularly about either sustainability or inclusiveness. They are smart, they're very clever, there's no question. And they do build on connectivity, on embeddedness, you know, those related variety, all those kind of elements of regions which people at the European Commission and across ERSA have done a great deal of study and analysis on. So they do those things, but they don't necessarily have directionality in terms of building those complementarities. So our argument is to rethink, to restructure how we think about smart specialization, so that then the regional agenda and the local agenda becomes inherently a key part of the Green Deal agenda. Because the Green Deal agenda, when you see these kind of Green Deal lists, or you look at the Paris Agreement or the UN Sustainable Goals, I mean, this is like a list, it's written by a committee. You can see that, it's just basically a bit of everything's in there. The problem is, to make progress, you need a huge amount of small steps forward on a very wide range of fronts, which are explicitly trying to address head on these trade-offs and complementarities. And they're going to be different in different places. So to have a much more explicit S4, where it's smart for sustainable, smart for inclusive, then starts to give a structure, a dimensionality to smart specialization, which is also consistent with the Green Deal objectives. And why it's important to do this. The first thing is, it's essential to build a unifying narrative. And why is that important? Because climate change mitigation strategies tend to hurt the weaker regions more than the more prosperous regions. So if you think about a lot of the big IT companies, the big technology companies producing smart solutions for, you know, thermal management, heat emissions, traffic management, mobility flows, you know, these kind of companies will be, you know, falling head over heels to get in working alongside places like Copenhagen or Stockholm or Amsterdam. You know, the prosperous cities which are high tech, that's exactly what they're going to enjoy. That's good for their marketing, their PR, they can trial, they can test a lot of these things. The problem is that many parts of Europe don't have those advantages, and the private sector are not particularly going to be interested immediately jumping to go and work with weaker regions or weaker cities in more peripheral parts of Europe. There's very little private sector incentive to do that. And at the same time, many of the weaker places in Europe are actually affected the most adversely by climate change mitigation strategies, because they are both carbon intensive and carbon extensive in terms of what they're doing. Their individual industries are often very carbon intensive, so climate change mitigation strategies are likely to cost those industries significantly. And also there's many of them, whole supply chains cutting across different fields, whereas places which are already more prosperous tend to be less carbon intensive or carbon extensive. So when you have climate change mitigation strategies, the opportunities for those places are very high, and the costs and the opportunity costs for those places tend to be very low. Whereas for weaker regions, the opportunities tend to be lower and the opportunity costs are higher. So immediately what you get is a partitioning in terms of the incentives of different type places to take on board the Green Deal strategy type of thinking. And you see this in the United States. I mean, people voting against Green Deal type ways of thinking heavily in places like West Virginia. You can understand it, because if they lose their jobs, they lose everything. You know, whatever we say about climate change, those people say our jobs depend on this. So if you're going to help us to respond to climate change, then you've got to compensate us. But there's not many people in Boston or Silicon Valley putting their hands in their pockets to compensate miners in West Virginia. This is also a European-wide problem. The places that have the greatest incentives to adopt Green Deal technologies, also the places which both have the greatest opportunities to exploit the technologies and are also least affected adversely by the rollout of those technologies. And of course, cohesion policy is focused on helping the weaker places. So this is a critical issue of how to align. And the smart specialization agenda, which is of course already very, very advanced across Europe, led by the JRC, actually gives you a framework, a template, and also a huge amount of experience on which to build these new narratives, these new policy approaches, because by definition, they'll be locally owned, locally driven, locally designed. They'll be funded, which is part of the compensation agenda, to help those places search for solutions so that they are not excessively adversely affected by the climate change steps forward. That's the point. That's how you in a sense buy in incentives. That's how you align incentives so the weaker places can basically come on board also with those challenges. We don't solve climate change just because Amsterdam and Copenhagen can do it, because most places are not like Amsterdam or Copenhagen. You're not going to get any demonstration effects. You're not going to get wider participation. But if you can do things in Cluj in Romania and Katowice, you can do them in places like that, then absolutely everyone will look at it and think, well, if Palermo can do it, or Cluj can do it, or Katowice can do it, then we should be doing it just as much. The demonstration effect is extremely important here. And then that starts to take on board and address the kind of governance issues associated. It may involve certain kind of limiting power of incumbents, trialing, piloting of new activities, redefinition of certain types of jurisdictions, but these kind of challenges were always there in cohesion policy anyway. So that's nothing new as such. It's just, if we have a directionality, then we have to do this in the specific context of smart for sustainable and smart for inclusive. So I think I'll finish that. I've got quite a lot more slides, but I think just in terms of time, but my point is that you've got to make small steps on multiple fronts at the same time. That's how you start to make progress. And the way to do that is you've got to galvanize local ownership and incentives to take on board these challenges. It's no good the European Commission coming out with big announcements unless localities, which are more likely to be adversely affected by these policies, also are able to see these policies as, actually, this gives us real opportunities. And cohesion policy and the whole smart specialization framework and agenda is just ideally placed, I think, to play precisely that role. Okay, I'll just stop sharing my screen there, Martina. Okay.
Many thanks, Philip, for your contribution. I think it underlines very clearly the increasing need for clear directionality, no, of innovation-led responses, and the topic of ownership, no, that you put forward in order to make EU policy successful and implemented. I think this, many thanks. This leads us nicely to the second contribution by Brionni Godwin-Hawkins. Brionni is a senior research fellow at the Countryside and Community Research Institute, which is one of the largest specialist rural research center in the UK. So we are entering a new world of rural development. She is an interdisciplinary social scientist working towards sustainable, inclusive futures for rural places and people. And she has been involved in different Horizon 2020 projects. She is currently operational lead for the National Innovation Centres for Rural Enterprise in Southwest England. Today, she will share with us her reflection on rural innovation ecosystems for resilience and well-being. I think a very important words today. Please, Brionni, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Martina, and thank you for that warm welcome. Thank you also to Philip for that fantastic paper. I found myself nodding greatly in agreement, and it's tempting to immediately respond, but I shall plow on with my own slides instead. Can you see my screen, Martina? Fantastic.
Well, Brionni, just I will take the opportunity, as you said, that to clarify with the audience that my second link to the report is the right one. Actually, I send first the link on my chronology, so just for you to know how much I care about this report too, and I share also the view of Brionni. Okay, many thanks. The floor is yours.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, when I proposed this title of Rural Innovation Ecosystems, I was hoping I could share with you some of the first results from our nice rural business survey here in England, which we will have 3,000 businesses. And unfortunately, we're not yet ready in our analysis to share anything, but I am pleased that I am following on from Philip's paper, because instead of giving you a data and results paper, I want to give you some more provocations and food for thought. Now, my departure point here, as it always is that rural people and places matter. They do deserve good lives and real futures. And they don't just matter because they have stopped voting the ways that we wanted them to. I do think that, as Phil has raised a number of points about climate change, but it's also important here. I do think that the ways we look at territory is also reflecting a mirror of the way that we look at our society more broadly. And if we can't look at that inclusively, then we've got some wider problems as well. I want in this then to look at what seem to be some of the compelling visions of post-pandemic recovery that are being put forward by rural places. And I want to think about whether they will really prove smart strategies in the most broad sense. And then I particularly want to pick up on this concept that we've seen come through the rural vision. We've seen it come through talk about pandemic recovery. We've seen it in the theme for this Congress. Is that theme of resilience, and to think a bit more about that. Now, I am going to give you a UK-based and in fact mostly Welsh perspective, but it does have European sympathies. And for those of you who know your accents very well, I've got an Antipodean accent. Okay. So first I want to set the scene, and in some senses, has COVID been an urban pandemic? Now this is 2020 data, so this is the early months of 2020 in the UK. And COVID here very much looked like it was following urban patterns, and as Mike Woods has pointed out, it also tended to initially follow GDP, because it was following often value chains and mobility lines. Now that green arrow there is where I was throughout 2020. I was in a village of 2,000 people, which I didn't leave for an entire year, except to go to somewhere even smaller. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my experience here. And here are some images from that time. Now, in those early stages, when we had this idea of an urban pandemic, we had a lot of protests. There were banners out telling people to stay away, not to come here. It is significant that they are in English, because this is quite a bilingual, strongly Welsh speaking area. And as you can see, that the second image are the lists of local shops, which is provided in Welsh for the residents. But then we also saw, as this sort of fear melted away, we saw a lot of adaptation, particularly amongst our small businesses who went to all sorts of interesting things about digital adoption. It's down in the corner as our greengrocer who converted to becoming a one-stop collection shop after you could do a sort of click online and then go and collect your vegetables. Our local bookshop provided educational materials for parents schooling at home and redeveloped their window to be a community gallery. So we saw lots of smaller businesses who were able to adapt. Now, Philip has already gone over, I think, a broad brush picture of some of those COVID effects. And certainly in rural areas, we saw a mixed picture. We saw some vulnerabilities there, initial concerns around demographics, particularly concerns around services and infrastructures. There were worries here about the extent to which this could build on existing marginalisation effects. We did see particular sectoral impacts and land use conflicts, but we also saw, as I mentioned, adaptation, including different forms of diversification. They're able to build on embeddedness in a very local sense. And we also saw a rise of well-being narratives, where often rural people talking about, well, they may be locked down, but they had access to green space and they had access to community support. Now, what I want to start thinking about is, in terms of thinking about recovery, or at least moving forward, I tend to hear, and I work a lot in local government with local governments at a small scale, 3 scenarios that have come up. And I've called them the localist buzz, which is really this idea of capitalizing on trends for shopping and working locally. I think those trends did really prove to be relatively short-lived, but we have seen this connect to increasing policy interest in the pandemic as an opportunity for forms of relocalization, including, for example, community wealth building, which deals with procurement. We've seen as well scenarios around staycations, particularly in the UK, the idea that there are the possibility to revive domestic tourist markets. And we've seen as well this quite strong narrative, which I think of as the Zoom town boom. They've been called Zoom towns in the US quite strongly, which is this idea of using remote working opportunities to support professional employment in rural areas. There's particular interest that this could help reverse depopulation patterns or the depopulation within particular demographic groups. Now, these are very compelling visions. As I said, I spend a lot of time with local governments. I can quite often visit economic development departments of one, and people know that they have had a very hard search for rural solutions, particularly with a lot of discourses around urban triumph, a lot of interest in investing in cities, but also the longer term effects of austerity budgets, which have had quite strong effects on our councils here in the UK. I think really these scenarios are seen not simply as something that is about pandemic recovery, but as an opportunity to redress longer term processes of rural marginalization. So we see here a focus on supporting small business ecosystems. They tend to be very place-based in orientation, by which I mean literally a village or a town. And they particularly have placemaking concerns. They tend to be strongly concerned with those shops and services that are often very symbolic of a place's vitality. And they often have, not always explicitly, counter narratives to these left behind discourses. They put forward a small scale politics, and they also focus, I mean, what rural people have been telling me in a lot of qualitative interview work that I have done over the years is they see well-being as part of a slower pace of life in smaller places. And there is often a certain sense of delight and relief. Have people finally discovered this that we've been talking about all along? But are these really smart strategies? Well, to be honest, I'm a little bit doubtful here. And I think those first two are probably looking at staying behind in much the same ways. There is often, particularly coming back to supporting what in the UK are called high streets, your shopping districts, there is a tendency to be looking back to the past that people see themselves as having lost in rural areas, rather than reconsidering what possible futures might look like. They can often end up being stuck on amenity-based path dependencies rather than something that we would call true specialization. We see that, for example, in the territorial innovation model literature often says, well, rural districts could specialize in some kind of amenity. They could specialize in mountains, for example. Well, is it a real specialization? And are you just going to then be locked into mountains, as we have seen with some land use conflicts in Wales? They also tend to be supporting retail and hospitality sectors, which are important and are important in aggregate, but on a street level do tend to be quite low paying. We're already seeing emerging labour issues here in the UK. The media over the weekend was reporting that they're currently looking at around 10% vacancy rates because they just can't get the staff. And also the staff can't afford to rent in rural areas because now all of the rental properties are Airbnbs. So we have a number of issues around here which are emerging. I also like, and this is a map I have shamelessly stolen from a newspaper, which shows you the actual patterns of working from home. It's not disaggregated, but I think it's fascinating. There is the sense that now all of these people in London who have been working from home are suddenly going to filter out into rural areas. I think, yes, that will happen for a few areas where we will see new winners, but they will build on existing advantages, particularly rapid and seamless transport connections to London for when people are going back to day work in their jobs periodically. We also know that lifestyle mobility works on relative affluence. What I mean by that is if you are selling a property in London, a rural property will potentially be quite affordable to you, whereas for local rural residents, they may not be able to afford that same property. So we could already see a divergence here in who can afford to buy and to live in rural places. Now, the other important thing that I think this map suggests to us is the workers may be coming into rural areas, but the power and the profits will not be following them. It will be staying in that headquarters. And I think, and there is also a risk here of a digital escalator effect, where instead of digitally commuting to my regional town, I will now digitally commute to London. So we could see patterns of hollowing out in some areas. And I do think we need to take that seriously before we jump on this scenario as being a savior here. Okay, so localism, I don't think will save us. And I always go back to one of my favorite articles, Bourne and Purcell, on the local trap. There is nothing automatically good, sustainable, inclusive, or smart about the local scale or any scale. We tend to replicate a lot of Gemeinschaft myths about rural places as these places of lovely community. We forget that sometimes that is not there, and sometimes those communities can be exclusive. For example, we know in areas of Wales that we have issues with white flight, which is white people leaving more ethnically diverse cities because they want to be in places that are less ethnically diverse. But also more broadly here, rural studies scholars have said, have had a number of critiques of endogenous development. The main one here, which I think is important, is that it is always limited by local capacity, but it also overlooks local power dynamics, particularly capacities for elite capture. But of course, as Philip has already suggested in his talk, the unicorns won't save us either. We know, and the wonderful panel this morning from the TASTE project reinforced that high growth firm-oriented strategies don't reflect rural realities. We have an academic recognition that exemplary regions like Silicon Valley are exceptions rather than models, but we still see a lot of rural areas having the allure of big dreams. And at the same time, we're seeing at the moment quite a few solutions shopping for problems. So I quite often end up being on a panel with a man, and it always is, who says, you've got rural problems, I've got driverless cars. And I sort of have to think, well, our councils can barely afford to run a school bus. They're not going to buy a fleet of driverless cars, pave the roads. And the people who will profit from driverless cars will be the people who design and sell driverless cars, which won't be our rural communities. Always a bit grumpy about that one, sorry. So what I think here is, I want to come back again, as I mentioned at the start, as I look towards wrapping up here, to the rural vision, which calls us to this theme of resilience, which is important. There are, of course, 3 degrees of resilience, if we look at the literature around that. Now, robustness is that ability to withstand a shock. Adaptability, some of those small business changes, the capacity to change, but without really changing underlying systems. And then finally, transformation, which is how can we transform resiliently, which changes our systems and our structures at scale. And I think if we're talking about resilience, particularly if we think of climate, we think of leaving post-extractive economies, we think of the broader changes in agriculture, including CAP reform, we are undergoing transformations. and we need transformational resilience in rural areas rather than simply bouncing back. It's also important to remember, as spatial justice thinking points us, that we need to be looking at how are rural people being included in these transformations? How are they able to participate in them? Now, transformation raises us a number of challenges. We know that people continue to experience change through place, yet we also know that regions are always relative and relational. We know that rural forces need extra local resources, yet we know that urban growth engine strategies don't usually do a very good job of pulling rural regions along behind them. We know that economies need to support well-being, not just GDP, but sometimes we forget that we need to politicize well-being and understand that there are trade-offs, not just for economies, but that if we put well-being statistics into existing competitiveness-based economies, do we really want well-being to be something that is competed for rather than should be something that is more universal? And this is very old data, but I love this map. This is commuting patterns in Monmouthshire, one of our rural counties in Wales. And in the circle there is the city region. So this is a functional rural area, if you like. What we're actually seeing is considerable patterns of movement between towns rather than rural to urban. We're not very good at designing for that. We can do the city, we can do the individual town. We're not good at getting that system going. Okay, now Martina's looking at me, so I better wrap it up. Now, this is the point where I would love to come in as Superman and say I can solve rural development. Unfortunately, if I knew exactly how to solve rural development, I wouldn't be in my chair, I'd be in Alessandro's. But I do want to end with a few very modest propositions about where I would like to see some of our thinking happen. And I think this will echo a lot with what Andre and colleagues were talking about this morning. I do think that we need to move towards what Bettina Bock has called a nexogenous paradigm, which is multi-scalar and multi-actor forms of connectivity. And this might mean that we're talking about a space-based form of development rather than simply place-based. I think we need innovation ecosystems, but in rural areas, we also need to be talking about how we are innovating in ecosystems. And the theme of borrowing size came out from the TASTE project's work this morning. And that might, for example, involve looking at new combinations of territorial and platform models for ecosystems. I do think we need to be thinking about how we reconnect the rural and what Jennifer Clark calls working regions, which bring in vertical integration between innovation and production. And finally, as I've been exploring with colleagues in the Robust project, I do think we need to be rethinking rural-urban connections. Not just that model where we have an engine and we have the train carriages, but we need to have more critical approaches to this. And in Robust, we like to talk about mutual benefit. I want to push that as a normative ideal rather than something we can necessarily achieve. But I think sometimes we end up saying that it is somehow a benefit that the city gets a financial sector and rural places get cheese. And I think we need to criticize what is the balance of benefits here and how can we make that, it will never be perfectly equal, but how can we make that so that we're not just supporting banking jobs here and waitressing jobs here? And on that note, I will leave it. Thank you, Martina.
Thank you a lot, Brioni. You said that you were offering us food for thought, and I think you really succeed in that. And I also really appreciate how the two presentations, the one from Brioni and the one from Philip, are echoing each other and working really well together. I think I'm really happy that we can offer these ideas in this session. Then we can now move to the third presentation, by Kristiina Jokelainen. She will bring us to Lapland and she will offer us the opportunity to really dig into specific policy challenges and solutions when implementing an innovation-led economic transformation strategy. In fact, Kristiina offers a, let's say, more policy-oriented and policy-making practical point of view into this session. She is a consultant with extensive experience in providing support to regional innovation ecosystem stakeholders, mainly in Eastern and Northern Finland, and working on smart specialization and international networking. She has been working for the Regional Council of Lapland, in fact, with a leading role in the implementation of the regional smart specialization strategy called Arctic Smartness. And in her presentation, she will illustrate the next step of the smart specialization strategy post-COVID. Kristiina, if you are ready, you can start.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the previous speakers as well. Definitely there was a lot of food for thought, at least I felt like that. And I think you will see my presentation now. Okay, and thank you for the opportunity to join the event and share the feelings from the northernmost regions of European Union, from Lapland. And yes, I will do my best to illustrate the way how we have worked in Lapland now, and how we are trying to tackle the challenge what we have faced with the COVID-19. And just to shortly to introduce the audience that we are the one of the most sparsely populated region in the whole European Union. And not having that many inhabitants, having a bit more rangers than inhabitants. But at the same time, what is the role of our region in the whole European Union is that we are definitely the most richest region with the natural resources, forestry, but also in the relation of mining industry, and particularly the transition to the green and digital transition together are at the same time providing us a huge opportunities, but the even huger challenges as well to cope with these possibilities, and to find the balance with the sustainable development, and with all the ideas and the priorities behind the Green Deal transition. What is the core strategy for the whole Europe at the moment. This is also to demonstrate that what is the relation with some of the very crucial businesses for our region, tourism, but at the same time also for the refining industry. And that was also the kind of a starting point for our smart specialization development in the Lapland some years ago, 2014, when we launched the first strategy. And even in that strategy already, the core priority was sustainability, how to do and how to support the sustainable development in our region, and the balanced development of our industries as well. Although we are not that many, we still have a very strong educational structure. We have universities, we have University of Applied Sciences, strong vocational education, and also the Indigenous People Institute. And then we have some national research institutions have their regional offices as well in Lapland. And shortly, what is Arctic Smartness? Arctic Smartness is our main tool to put our smart specialization into the practice. And from the very beginning, we initiated and actually took the regional cluster initiative to be our own. And when we talk about the clusters, it's a kind of combination of different type of clusters. We have a clear industry-driven clusters, but then we have clusters which are more like innovation clusters supporting the region industries to grow and develop the businesses. But then we also see that RT Smartness it's a kind of ecosystem that from the very beginning we saw that that could be the main driver also for our sustainable regional development. And it is also the tool to develop and sustain the networking activities in our region and carrying out the different instruments and individual activities to engage the local stakeholders and municipality authorities and towns and all different businesses as well. And the main success there is this strong networking initiative and the cooperation between the businesses and developers. And from the very beginning, of course, the main idea behind was that how we can find a way to utilize the existing research, development, and innovation activities for the benefit for the industry and the business, and particularly target those resources to make it sustainable way. So we saw our regional activities, and when we updated our smart specialization 2019, we saw that we have three main angles which will be there as a core. So the angle number one, the priority number one, is to recognize our main industries and be as a target for the development. Angle number two was to recognize our expertise and innovation strength and target them towards the growth of the business, but also to support the international business activities. And angle number three, the regional ecosystem where the clusters, the industrial clusters are also operating, were seen as an enabler for this collaboration. And in the RT Smartness, we see that by putting these three forces together, we can generate the best entrepreneurial process, but at the same time also to generate the new digital solutions, energy efficiency, and put in place the sustainable policies reflecting to the European strategies, and at the same time to find a way how to generate the continuous innovation and answer the demand of the low carbon economy. And then, of course, in we think about this case and situation of the COVID-19, and when it hit us as well as it hit everyone else, it's of course always the test bed also for that how the regional ecosystem is working in practice, and it really showed the weak points, but also the strong points, which we could with what we could work further, but also the weak points which we have to tackle and find a solution for the future. Here is a bit to showcase that how we actually structured that these three clusters, who we would like to call innovation clusters, are led by the universities and research institutions, but generating this capacity for the industry to grow, and focusing on those industries which have been recognized as a core sectors in our region, in our territory as well. And then as a part of this ecosystem, we see also these industrial clusters as a main driving tools together with our governance mechanism to support the business to grow and to provide the services for them to grow. And all that is led then the Regional Council of Lapland, which is having the strategic responsibility of our regional development, managing the cohesion policy and related funding tools as well in that relation, but also leading the EU level collaboration when it comes to the smart specialization and thematic partnership, and also to initiating the regional connections with the other regions. Okay, what are the challenges and possibilities if we think about this situation where we are? And I made a kind of pick up the two practical cases. If we talk about the Arctic industry and circular economy cluster, so the business in that relation hasn't suffered about the COVID-19 as tourism. That's obvious for everyone. I think so. And actually, if we think about this transition, green and digital transition, has actually caused the situation where, for example, the mining industry is growing and the price of minerals are higher than ever at the moment. But if we think about, for example, the increasing the electric car, windmills, and everything like that, it needs new raw materials. And the reality is that when we are trying to decrease the use of fossil fuels and energy sources, it means that we have to get the other resources to replace them. And when it comes to the windmill, for example, it means that we need iron, we need chrome, and we need other minerals to build them up. And when it comes to the batteries, we need the cobalt. And even the case of the cobalt, for example, from our original point of view, is that if we pick up the 20 largest cobalt deposits in the European Union, 14 biggest cobalt deposits are in Finland, and out of 4 biggest deposits, 3 of those are in Lapland. So that is for the future point of view. It's gonna make huge challenges, huge opportunities, but at the same time, we have to work very hard on that how we can develop our processes and practices to support the new refining, but at the same time, how to make it resource efficient way as possible. How to start the circular economy process from the very beginning of the very important industrial value chains of the European Union, not just recycling, but recycling the end product, but how to start it from the very beginning, because that's the matter of the surviving for us, and that's the one of the main development target in our cluster of Arctic industry and circular economy, but one of the main research, development, and innovation target as well, how to develop these practices and how to automatize and digitalize the operations, and how to guarantee that everything is done with most efficient way and no waste will be produced as such. But then at the same time, if we think about the Arctic sustainable tourism, so it really hit very hard. If you remember earlier, I mentioned that it was the fastest growing industry before the COVID-19, and I think that's the situation in many other cases as well in the European Union. And actually, 80% of a tourist business, the income of the 80% of the tourism business income went down, and that was, of course, a big shock for our industry. And then when the most of the industries, in our case, were the industries as well who just have made huge investment to develop their practices and to fulfill the demand of the customer and find a way how to make it more sustainable way. And now, luckily, it looks like that is getting better. At least looks like that. But then what happens with the tourism business is that of course, the Finnish customers saved the business away, kind of way, and made them to survive from the current situation. But still the the loss of the labor forces was one of the biggest hit for our tourism industry, because most of the labor forces came out from the region, because it was mainly the winter tourism and the labor forces were working during the winter time in the Lapland and then the summertime in the southern part of Finland or something like that. So we lost that forces, and now what is the biggest challenge at the moment is that where to find the labor for the industry and sustain the quality services, and particularly when we want to talk about the green tourism, that how to make it happen in practice, how to develop these businesses now, and how to get the skilled working labor for the industry, and how to sustain the practices. And that is really the big challenge at the moment. And jointly, the whole ecosystem is putting now a lot of effort on that how to solve and how to anticipate the coming winter season. But what was the lucky point, if we could say in that way, that we used to have very little summer tourism, and most of the destinations were closed during the summertime. But due to this COVID situation, we actually have had very, very successful summer seasons already last summer, last year, but this year as well, because of the tourists from Finland. But then at the same time, there was one other phenomenon as well. And when we talk about home working, but then we could also talk about the distance working, and quite substantial number of people from southern Finland had bought the second home from Lapland in order to continue with their distance working. And when it comes to the municipality economic point of view, this is a very, very important issue, because that will guarantee kind of continuous income also for the different other industries than in the municipalities and very remote areas too.
Christina, excuse me,
And,
you only have 2 minutes
okay.
left.
Yes.
Thanks.
Yes, no problem, because I have a last one here. So but then to summarize actually this, I wanted to just to show these 2 examples, because there are very contradictions between each others, but and the other one with the really global business impacted by the Green Deal, giving the opportunities, but at the same time the challenges as well. And then the other one, very local business and very micro business driven industry. But then to deal with this issue and to solve the challenges in the ecosystem, the regional council actually took, as a part of the smart specialization, some initiatives, and the time was very much used, of course, with general COVID actions, but then how to sustain the ecosystem and how to sustain the collaboration in the ecosystem. Number of different kind of roadmap were done. And I believe that one of the most interesting roadmap was this Lapland Green Deal, how to localize the European Green Deal priorities and highlighting the sustainable development goals and how to fit them in our circumstances. And then actually this particular case will impact to this, how we are now generating the next generation smart specialization, and how to particularly focus on the post-COVID-19 actions, and to see that how we can match the different situation with the different needs, but at the same time, how to sustain that what was workable and supported the region over the situation until today. But then it was also at the same time the new approach by the clusters. They had to look and see that how they have to be to react fast and reflect the needs. And at the same time, when the business clusters were focusing on their daily work, support the industry and facilitate services for the benefit of SMEs and support them with the funding resources. Our innovation clusters were very active on developing their service chain development in the relation of technology readiness levels, but also actively being on this European level digital innovation hub process. And now they are in two application process as well, which is a very big thing for the Lapland and for our Arctic Smartness concept as such. And then of course there were a number of regional development projects under Arctic Smartness umbrella to support the continuation and to seek for the future possibilities. So thank you, and you can get details from the Regional Council, who will be happy to answer more for the questions if you have them. Thank you.
Many thanks, Christina, for this very detailed explanation of what is going on the different on a specific territories in Europe. We have collected some questions. I will go for the first one from Theodora Dogaru to Philip Mckenn. And I'm trying to summarize it, but basically Theodora would like to know to what extent, Philip, you think that the types of regional networks that the Agenda 2020 fostered have been effective, productive in pairing regions for regional development, and is there a need in rethinking the different macro regions where funds will be allocated for the future cohesion policy program, I guess. And I would ask you to be quite short in your answer. So but basically the question is if you think that the types of regional networks that cohesion policy programs fostered have been productive in pairing regions for regional development.
Thank you, Martina. Yeah, I can see the question here. I have to be honest, I don't think I haven't really thought about it in that way. That's a good question. I guess the issue would be, what was the logic in defining the macro regions and then assessing whether that logic that was originally used is in any way changed by the kind of Green Deal smart specialization interaction. So I would need to think about that. That's a pretty good question. If, for example, if I think about the Baltic region, I would have thought the answer would be definitely no. The common feature of the Baltic region, in terms of a macro region agenda, was not the fact that they're all Nordic countries. So there's a cultural identity issue. It was to do with the fact that the Baltic is a very shallow sea, and shallow seas have different challenges to deep water environments. They're much more vulnerable in certain contexts. So if you think about the Green Deal regional development interface in the context of the Baltic Sea type context, then that would seem to be a perfectly sensible way of thinking about it. The same way the kind of the Danube regions. Again, what links those regions is the issue of the workings of the Danube River, all the water-related and energy-related issues tied up there. So probably, again, thinking in terms of the Green Deal, the answer would be no. It would probably make sense to kind of use the same framework. In terms of things like the Balkan regions in the southeast, I think I probably couldn't give an answer on that. I'd need to ask, Slava Radosevich or somebody like that, somebody who just really knows the details of the region. But I think the principle would be, what was the logic in the first place, and to what extent is that logic altered when thinking about the interaction between the environmental challenges and the kind of S4 plus approach? Would that be altered in any way? And I think that would be the way to think about the answer.
Thanks, Philip. I think that the question and also your answer leads also to make a comment and then a question to you all, because indeed we have seen that the COVID-19 has affected different places in different ways, with some territories more able to react than others. Indeed, there are macroeconomic factors, variables to explain that, but also there are soft elements. And from your presentations, all of them, I would say, it emerged very clearly that in order to get effective responses to the COVID-19, we cannot go only global, but we need to call for identification of local innovation opportunities and the capacity of creating meaningful value out of them, and I mean meaningful for whom is also a point to be made. This is clearly a matter of multi-level governance and how we make power and knowledge interact. Basically, no? What is basically the whole Barca report is. To be rough, is about that. So I would like to know from your different points of view, and I would ask you to be very short, let's say 1 minute each of our speaker. What are for you the key incentives for putting in place governance arrangements that are able to blend different kind of knowledge, including scientific knowledge that for some less equipped territories is the key missing factor, or also what policy frameworks you think can help in doing that? Thanks. I will start with Brionni.
I was hoping you noticed I had a really puzzled face on. I was trying to think, what is my answer to that question? Perhaps I want to take this in a slightly different direction by noting the point that Dimitri Korpakis has made in the chat. I think we probably do need to figure out what is the relationship between the Green Deal and S4, and how would we then build that into quadruple helix arrangements that are able to work both at a territorial level, but also at multiple scales of governance as well. The incentives, that's the €1 million question.
Okay, thanks. Unfortunately, I don't know, Christina, if you want to add something, because we are unfortunately we were so kept by your presentations, all of you, that we are almost closing the session. So if you agree, I would thank all of you speakers and participants for this very interesting session, and I invite you to join the second session of this roundtable at 16:15, within 15 minutes. I remind you, we'll be with the Professor Klaus Kunzmann, and we'll share the experiences of Milano and Bilbao in that session, and remind that there is a different link to the second session. And I will use these few seconds, because the VC goes down, to really thank you all. I think that there is a lot of things to discuss further between the speakers, the ERSA community, and the JRC for a number of activities we are working on now. And we really thank you for your contributions, your reflections, very deep reflections indeed. And let's hope that the recovery will be sustainable and based on innovation as we wish. Thanks a lot to you all. See you in a few minutes. Thanks.
Thank you
again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.